On a cold January morning in 1887, workers on a California mountaintop lowered the body of a dead millionaire into a hole in the ground. It was not a grave, it was a foundation. James Lick, once the richest man in California, was sealed beneath the pier of the largest telescope on Earth. The machine rising above his bones was not built by astronomers. It was designed and manufactured by two machinists from Cleveland, Ohio, men who had never constructed anything close to that size and who won the contract by bidding a third higher than firms with far more experience. Their company would go on to map the heavens, arm the United States through 2 world wars, and build half the turret lathes in America. Then corporate raiders tore it apart. Its name disappeared, and its flagship factory rotted on Carnegie Avenue for 40 years. This is the story of Warner and Swasey. Before the story begins, you are watching Trade Archive. If industrial history told properly is what you came for, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because there is a century of it ahead. The story starts on a farm outside Cummington, Massachusetts, in 1846, where Worcester Reed Warner was born into a family that could give him books, but not a college education. The farmhouse had a serious home library, and the boy read his way through it, developing a fixation on astronomy that never left him. At 19, he moved to Boston to learn mechanical drawing, then drifted to a machine shop in Exeter, New Hampshire. That drift decided everything, because working in that same Exeter shop was a local apprentice machinist born the same year, a schoolhouse-educated New Englander named Ambrose Swasey. Swasey had grown up in Exeter, learned his trade at the bench, and showed an unusual gift for solving mechanical problems that stumped older men. The two apprentices became roommates and then fast friends, the kind of friendship that survives 50 years of business without a recorded falling out. In 1870, both men left New Hampshire together for Hartford, Connecticut, and hired on at Pratt Whitney, then one of the premier machine tool builders in the world. Pratt Whitney in the 1870s was the finishing school of American precision. This was the era when the company worked with Harvard to fix the American standard inch to within millionths, producing the reference bar known as bronze number 11. And the shop culture around that project taught its men how to heat-treat steel and hold tolerances that most factories considered fantasy. Warner and Swasey entered as journeyman mechanics and rose fast. Swasey took charge of the gear-cutting department, where he invented a machine for generating the true theoretical curves of gear teeth, an epicycloidal milling machine that Pratt Whitney added to its own product line. He presented his method for cutting spur gear teeth in a paper to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers while still a shop foreman. Warner ran the planing department and was trusted enough to manage the company's showpiece exhibit at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. On that trip east, a young assistant astronomer named Edward Holden ushered Warner into the closed dome of the United States Naval Observatory in Washington and let the farm boy stand under a great refractor. Warner never forgot it. Neither did Holden. By 1880, the two foremen had saved a combined $10,874, roughly $5,000 apiece, and in April of that year, they quit Hartford to start their own machine tool business. They chose Chicago, renting a storefront at 249 Canal Street, and the venture nearly died there. The building was infested with rats, which the two founders threw rocks at during lunch, and the city simply did not have the pool of highly skilled mechanics their designs demanded. They skimped on firewood through one Chicago winter. In 1881, they moved the operation to Cleveland, Ohio, a city thick with trained machinists and surrounded by the customers who needed them, and set up shop near the corner of East 55th Street and Carnegie Avenue. Their first Cleveland order was for 12 turret lathes. They would build that machine, in one form or another, for the next 100 years. The partnership worked because the two men never competed for the same job. Warner was the strategist and the salesman, the partner who courted customers, watched markets, and carried the firm's face into boardrooms and observatory committees. and his designs leaned toward exactness and restraint. Swasey was the inventor, the partner who lived at the bench, developing new machines and new methods for achieving accuracy that did not yet exist anywhere else. And over his career, he put his name on roughly 24 patents. One man found the work. The other made the work possible. The turret lathe is the machine hiding inside almost everything the 20th century made. A conventional lathe requires the machinist to stop, unclamp, and reset tooling for every operation. Warner Swasey replaced the tailstock with a rotating hexagonal turret holding multiple tools, so an operator could drill, bore, face, and thread a part in rapid succession by indexing the next tool into position. For the repetitive production of duplicate parts, nothing else came close. In 1888, the company introduced its #1 turret lathe, the machine that historians of the trade regard as the first practical, production-ready turret lathe anywhere in the world. Brass fittings, sewing machines, bicycles, and eventually automobile components poured off Warner and Swasey turrets as American manufacturing exploded, and the later #3 lathe became the best-selling machine the company ever made, still shipping as the 3A into the early 1970s. More than 50,000 turret lathes would leave Cleveland carrying the Warner and Swasey nameplate. The lathe line itself grew into a full family of machines. The lighter ram-type universals, numbered 1 through 6, carried their turret on a sliding ram, quick to feed and quick to return, built for the fast, repetitive bar work that filled job shops across the country. The heavier saddle types, the 1A through the 5A, mounted the turret on a saddle that traveled the full bed of the machine, rigid enough to hog through long, heavy workpieces that would have shaken a lighter lathe loose. Later came the M-series designations, machines like the M1500 that ran from the 1930s into the 1950s, and the M3550 and M3580, big enough to swallow bar stock 9 and 12 inches across. The genius of all of them was who could run them. A conventional engine lathe demanded a craftsman making decisions at every cut. A Warner and Swasey turret, once a skilled setup man had arranged its tooling and stops, could be run by a semi-skilled operator turning out identical parts hour after hour at rates no man with a tool post could touch. That was the real product Cleveland was selling, the collapse of skilled minutes into semi-skilled seconds. The machines sold on that arithmetic into the early 1970s when numerical control began rewriting the trade, and surviving Warner and Swasey iron still changes hands among machinists today. What separated the shop from its rivals was not the idea of the turret. It was the fanatical precision underneath it, the Pratt and Whitney discipline transplanted whole into Cleveland. The founders introduced new methods of graduating and verifying their own work at every step. In 1897, the firm delivered a 6-inch transit circle to the Naval Observatory in Washington, built in steel when tradition demanded other materials, and that instrument stayed in service for over a century. The following year, Swasey built a dividing engine for the observatory, a machine whose only job was to scribe graduations fine enough to make other precision instruments possible. The setting circles on the firm's early telescope mountings were divided so finely that an observer could read positions to a single minute of arc on one circle and to seconds of time on the other, on hardware made a few blocks from a rail yard. Astronomers noticed. So did the Army. But the lathes were only half of the company's soul. From the very first year, while still in Chicago, the partners sold a 9.5-inch refracting telescope to Beloit College for $2,000, a sale arranged through Edward Holden, the same astronomer who had opened the Naval Observatory dome for Warner. Holden became the young firm's patron inside American astronomy, steering them small commissions, a dome for the Lick site, a portable mounting, and a 45-foot dome for the Leander McCormick Observatory in Virginia that the founders treated as a full-scale laboratory. Swasey applied the same discipline he had used on gear teeth to equatorial mountings. building drive mechanisms so accurate and so reliable that astronomers began to talk. Telescope work barely paid. What it bought was reputation, and the partners treated it as philanthropy, with a return measured in prestige. Then came the contract that made them famous on every continent. James Lick was an eccentric San Francisco real estate magnate who had once planned to build himself a tomb larger than the pyramids at Giza. Persuaded instead to fund science, he left $700,000 to build the greatest telescope on Earth atop Mount Hamilton, and he refused cremation before his death in 1876, insisting he would rot like a gentleman. The glass came from the Fayal Works in Paris, 2 massive blanks shipped across the Atlantic. The grinding and figuring of the 36-inch lenses went to Alvin Clark and Sons of Massachusetts, master opticians who polished final corrections into the surface with rouge on their bare thumbs under a contract worth $51,000. And the tube, the great equatorial mounting, the pier, the rising floor, and the revolving dome went to 2 machinists from Cleveland who pitched the trustees not as craftsmen, but as mechanical scientists, men who could calculate the flexure of a 57-foot tube at every angle of the sky. Their bid was a third higher than their competitors. They won anyway. The mounting alone ran to roughly $45,000, and the Great Dome to $85,000, and both had to work perfectly the first time because there was no second largest telescope on Earth to practice on. The closest thing to a rehearsal had been that 45-foot McCormick Dome in Virginia, where the partners had replaced the traditional ropes and pulleys of observatory work with rods and hand wheels an astronomer could operate without leaving the eyepiece. On Mount Hamilton, they scaled that thinking up to a rotating iron dome and an entire observing floor that rose and fell like an elevator to meet the eyepiece wherever the sky demanded it. Getting the machine up the mountain was its own campaign. Santa Clara County built a winding road with 367 turns over the final 7 miles just to keep the grade shallow enough for horse and mule teams hauling telescope components. In January 1887, Lick himself made the journey, his body carried up and reburied at the base of the pier beneath the observing floor so that the largest telescope in existence would stand on its patron's bones. A year later, on the bitterly cold night of January 3, 1888, the telescope refused to come to focus. A calculation of the focal length had missed. Warner and Swasey's engineers shortened the great tube by 6 inches on the mountain, in freezing darkness, and the 36-inch refractor opened its eye on the universe. The company that built its skeleton became, overnight, a global icon of scientific engineering. The encore was even larger. When the University of Chicago commissioned the 40-inch refractor for Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin, the glass was cast by Mantois of Paris, the lenses figured again by the Clarks, and the colossal mounting built again in Cleveland. Yerkes remains the largest refracting telescope ever successfully used for astronomy, a record set in the 1890s that will likely never fall. Commissions followed from the Naval Observatory, from Canada, from observatories across the world, including the mounting for the Dominion's 72-inch reflector, one of the first machines of its kind to ride on self-aligning precision ball bearings. Swasey eventually put the whole business model into one sentence at a dedication ceremony in 1920. "We get our money out of machinery," he said, "and our glory out of telescopes." The glory business eventually pulled the company all the way into glass itself. In 1933, Warner and Swasey opened its own optical shop and hired Robert Lundin to run it, and the hire was a statement because Lundin was optical royalty. His father had been the senior optician at Alvin Clark & Sons, and Robert had grown up in that workshop, assisting on the Yerkes 40-inch objective as a teenager, and later figuring the astrograph lens that Lowell Observatory used in the discovery of Pluto. Bringing him to Cleveland meant the firm that had always built the iron around other men's glass could now do the whole telescope under one roof. It also delivered the company its most public engineering humiliation. The 82-inch mirror for the McDonald Observatory in Texas, then set to become the second largest telescope in the world, sat in the Cleveland optical shop year after year, while astronomers rejected figure after figure until they finally uncovered a flaw in London's own testing procedure. The telescope was not completed until 1939, and a large photographic lens for the Naval Observatory from the same shop failed outright. Precision had built the company's name. Precision, when it slipped, could bruise it just as publicly. The money and the glory lived side by side in Cleveland. The two founders built adjoining mansions on Euclid Avenue, the stretch known as Millionaire's Row, with a shared driveway and, in the backyard between them, a shared private observatory housing a 9.5-inch refractor. Two lifelong friends, next-door neighbors, business partners for half a century, stepping out after dinner to look at the stars through an instrument their own shop had made. In 1900, the firm formally incorporated, and between 1904 and 1910, the original brick shop gave way to a sprawling 5-story factory at 5701 Carnegie Avenue, designed by architect Arnold Brunner, its sawtooth roof angled to pour north light onto the shop floors below. The complex grew with the company, adding foundry sheds of glass and steel, a wedge-shaped building squeezed into the angle of the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, and eventually hundreds of thousands of square feet of manufacturing floor. It became one of the anchors of industrial Cleveland, named in the same breath as the steel mills, the foundries, and the young automobile plants its lathes were tooling. War found the company perfectly positioned, because Warner and Swasey sat at the intersection of two competencies almost no one else combined: high-volume machine tools and precision optics. The firm had supplied artillery fire control instruments to the Army since the Spanish-American War, including the Depression Position Finder, along with rangefinders, battery commanders' telescopes, and naval gun sights. Its most famous instrument was the M1908 Telescopic Musket sight, a prismatic 6-power scope of blackened brass and steel designed by Ambrose Swasey himself, mounted offset on the left side of the M1903 Springfield rifle. The Army bought 25 for testing in 1906 at roughly $80 apiece, nearly twice the cost of the rifle underneath it, then ordered 1,000 in 1909 and over 1,000 more in 1912. The improved M1913 dropped the magnification slightly to brighten the image, and more than 5,700 were eventually produced, with Canada buying 500 for its Ross rifles. The sights fogged in the trenches and the rubber eye cup created a suction problem against the shooter's eye, solved in the field by punching holes in the rubber. They were imperfect instruments. They were also among the first optics ever issued to American snipers, and through the First World War, the Cleveland factory ran on musket sights, naval gun sights, panoramic sights, and parts for the Thompson submachine gun. The founders did not stay to see the Second War. Warner retired from active management in 1911 and moved east to an estate in Tarrytown, New York, where he built himself a home observatory and gave $300,000 to build the town a library. He died on June 25, 1929, in Eisenach, Germany, 4 months after the library's dedication, and the American Society of Mechanical Engineers still awards a medal in his name. Swasey outlived his partner by 8 years and gave his fortune away with both hands. After his wife Lavinia died in 1913, he funded the Engineering Foundation with nearly $900,000, endowed a physics chair at Case, built an observatory and a gymnasium for Denison University, and paid $400,000 for Swasey Chapel on the Denison campus, its tower carrying a carillon of 10 bells cast in his wife's memory. He went home to die, passing on June 15, 1937, on the family homestead in Exeter, where he had been born 90 years earlier. The moon carries a crater named for each of them. Very few machinists can say that. The company they left behind hit its absolute peak in the Second World War. By 1942, Warner Swasey ranked as the fourth largest machine tool builder in the United States, shipping on the order of 700 machines a month, and at the height of the war, the Carnegie Avenue complex employed 7,000 workers and produced roughly half of all the turret lathes manufactured in America. Those lathes were the machines behind the machines. A bomber plant could not cut engine parts, a shipyard could not turn shafts, and a tank arsenal could not finish components without machine tools on the floor, which meant every Warner Swasey lathe shipped from Cleveland multiplied itself through the entire war economy. The turret's old peacetime advantage became a weapon in its own right, because a nation drafting its craftsmen into uniform could put the wives, farmhands, and teenagers who replaced them onto a Warner Swasey turret after weeks of training instead of years of apprenticeship, and the parts came out identical either way. The Navy went a step further and bolted the lathes directly onto battleships so crews could machine replacement parts at sea. If the United States was the arsenal of democracy, Warner Swasey built a startling share of the arsenal's own tools. The unified wartime story, though, had a crack running through it, and it ran right past the factory gates. Cleveland's East Side was transforming through the Great Migration, and despite acute labor shortages, black workers found the doors of defense plants hard to open. In December 1942, Warner Swasey became the subject of a federal Fair Employment Practice Committee inquiry, and the city's black press covered the spectacle of union business agents and company management publicly passing responsibility back and forth over discriminatory hiring, each insisting the other held the key. The arsenal of democracy, it turned out, had a hiring office that did not always believe its own slogan. Peace brought no peace to the shop floor either. The men who had run those lathes around the clock through the war came home to find that wartime wage controls had ended, but wartime prices had not. And across American industry, the late 1940s turned into a season of confrontation between the executives who had profited from the war and the machinists who had built its tools. At Warner Swasey, the confrontation arrived in December 1948, when the members of the International Association of Machinists walked out of the Carnegie Avenue works. The strike ran 184 days, idling 1,800 workers and standing at the time as the longest strike in Cleveland's history. Archival photographs from June 14, 1949, show a mounted Cleveland police officer looming over a knot of strikers on the picket line along East 55th Street. 2 weeks after that photograph was taken, the strike ended. The men went back through the gates. The bitterness did not entirely go with them. Management could read the post-war landscape, and it knew military contracts would shrink, so the company went hunting for a peacetime product and found one in a rented garage in Beechwood, Ohio. Ray and Coop Verwerda were brothers who had emigrated from Holland in 1920 and built a Cleveland construction business, and by 1944, they were sick of watching cable-operated excavators butcher fine grading work that then had to be finished by men with shovels. Their answer was a machine with a triangular telescoping boom, hydraulically driven, that could extend, retract, tilt, and sweep like a human arm. Ray's wife Evelyn gave it a name, saying the machine used its arm to grade the earth and its hand to do all the other work. Gradal. Warner Swasey bought the patent rights in November 1945 and had the first production model, the M1903, being built in the Cleveland plant by January 1946. When the machine appeared at the 1948 Chicago Roadshow, contractors ranked it among the most important machines on the floor, and demand grew so fast that production moved to a dedicated plant in New Philadelphia, Ohio, in July 1950. Machine number 3 was found in an Akron junkyard in 1946, bought back for $500, and restored, a company relic marking the dawn of hydraulic excavation in America. The machine's telescoping arm turned out to be good at far more than grading. Gradals cleared snow, sculpted highway slopes, and reached into the mouths of blast furnaces for maintenance work no other machine could survive. And in 1958, the G1000 arrived as the largest production hydraulic excavator in the industry. The heavy equipment division kept growing around it, absorbing the Duplex Truck Company in 1955 and the Badger Backhoe Line in 1957. And for a while it looked like Warner and Swasey had pulled off a second act as big as the first. Yet even as the Great All dug foundations across the post-war boom, the ground under the parent company was quietly giving way. Foreign machine tool builders, rebuilt after the war and hungry, began taking market share through the 1960s. The workforce that had numbered 7,000 at the wartime peak had fallen to 2,000 by 1965, and the neighborhood outside the sawtooth windows was coming apart under decades of segregation, overcrowding, and neglect. In July 1966, the Hope neighborhood bordering the plant erupted into 6 days of rioting that left 4 people dead and whole blocks burned. The city begged its industrial anchors to reinvest in the east side. Warner and Swasey's actual answer arrived within 2 years, and it was an address change. In January 1968, the company moved its headquarters to University Circle, and that March, it opened a large new plant in the suburb of Solon. There was industrial logic behind both moves, a 5-story 1910 factory being a poor fit for modern single-floor production, but the logic did not change what it looked like from Hauff. The corporation that had grown up at East 55th and Carnegie, that had drawn its workforce from the streets around it for 80 years, was, step by step, leaving. The company's other Cleveland monument was dying at the same time, and for a crueler reason. Back in 1919, the founders had donated their private observatory tradition to the Case School of Applied Science, building the Warner and Swasey Observatory on a knoll in East Cleveland, a Walker and Weeks-designed temple of brick and stone dedicated in October 1920, and later home to the 24-inch Burrell-Schmidt telescope. Research done there in the early 1950s helped demonstrate that the Milky Way is a spiral galaxy. But the smoke and glow of the industrial city the company itself had helped build slowly blinded the instruments. Operations retreated to a rural station in Geauga County in 1957. The Burrell-Schmidt was shipped to Kitt Peak in Arizona in May 1979, and the Taylor Road building closed in 1982. Then came the scrappers for the copper, the vandals for the windows, and the graffiti crews for everything else. A building once called Cleveland's plumb line to the heavens spent decades as a ruin, its later private owner convicted of mortgage fraud, its domes open to the rain. There is a bitter symmetry in it. The company's telescopes were driven off their own hilltop by the smoke of the industry that paid for them. For the corporation, the end arrived wearing a suit. By the late 1970s, Warner and Swasey's depressed stock price had turned a proud old manufacturer into prey. In October 1979, the Canadian conglomerate behind AMCA International launched a surprise hostile tender offer at $57 a share, and when the company resisted, the raiders came back in December at $75. The blindsided board did what cornered boards did in that era. It fought the bid in federal court to buy time, and it went searching for a friendlier buyer, a white knight, finding one in the Bendix Corporation, which outbid the raiders and acquired Warner and Swasey in 1980 in a cash and stock deal valued at more than $290 million. The rescue was a mirage. A white knight is still an owner, and Bendix, squeezed by a brutal recession and increasingly distracted by its own corporate adventures, treated its new acquisition less like a legacy and more like a line item. The company's autonomy was stripped, domestic operations were cut back hard, product lines moved offshore, and the century of accumulated shop knowledge on Carnegie Avenue and in Solon was treated as overhead. Machinists who had spent whole careers holding tolerances in Cleveland iron watched the decisions get made from somewhere else. Then Bendix itself was swallowed by Allied in 1983, which sold Warner and Swasey to Cross and Trecker in 1984, which was in turn absorbed by Giddings and Lewis. In January 1992, the last Warner and Swasey plant in Solon closed its doors, ending roughly 111 years of machine building in Greater Cleveland. The brand that had tooled the American century was simply gone. What remained was the building. The Carnegie Avenue factory had been vacated in 1985, and for nearly 40 years, Arnold Brunner's masterpiece sat as a hulking monument to Rust Belt collapse. The roof caved. Stairwells crumbled. The site was contaminated, the interiors stripped by scrappers, and the complex became one of the most photographed urban exploration destinations in the Midwest. Photographers and documentary crews climbed rusted stairways and walked debris-filled production floors under the broken sawtooth glass, in halls where critical armament parts were once machined to tolerances measured in thousandths. Cuyahoga County floated a plan to move a government agency into the building in 1988. The city floated a municipal center in 1992. Nothing stuck, and demolition seemed inevitable, held off mainly by the sheer robustness of the structure and, in 2019, by its listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Then, the developer Penrose, working with the nonprofit Midtown Cleveland, spent years assembling one of the most complicated financing stacks in the city's recent history, $64 million in all. Penrose bought the 3-acre site from the city in the fall of 2025 for about $2.25 million, closed its financing that December, and crews broke ground in early 2026. The first phase will carve 112 affordable senior and family apartments into the historic shell, deliberately keeping the raw factory bones, the heavy timber and brick, and the sawtooth light, and adding a rooftop terrace where a shop floor roof once leaked. A second phase in the old Wedge building will add another 28 units and roughly 20,000 square feet of commercial space. People are expected to move in around 2028. The building where 7,000 workers once armed a nation will become a place where Clevelanders sleep. So, what did all of it mean? 2 apprentices met in a New Hampshire machine shop and stayed friends for life, and out of that friendship came the mounting under the largest refracting telescope humanity will ever build. The sights on America's first sniper rifles, half the turret lathes that tooled the arsenal of democracy, and the hydraulic excavator that reshaped post-war construction. The same story holds the FEPC file, the mounted police on the picket line, and a corporation that answered its burning neighborhood with a moving van, because industrial greatness and industrial failure were never separate stories. Even the name refused to fully die. Gradall still builds excavators in New Philadelphia after 80 years. The little 9.5-inch refractor from the founder's shared backyard now sits on a university rooftop in Cleveland. In 2022, a firearms company bought the dormant Warner and Swasey trademark and put it on a modern rifle optic, which means the name that aimed the M1903 Springfield is aiming rifles again a century later. And on Mount Hamilton, visitors still leave flowers on the brass plate over James Lick, beneath a telescope built by 2 machinists who understood something their raiders never did. Machines outlive money. Warner and Swasey got their money out of machinery and their glory out of telescopes, and the glory, it turns out, was the better investment. If this is the kind of story you want in your feed, subscribe to Trade Archive, because the next industrial empire is already on the screen.